The British justice system is the envy of the world. But in the past, mistakes have been made.
Between the year 1900 and the year 1964, approximately 800 people were hanged in the United Kingdom. Many of those desperately protested their innocence.
Some of these long-standing convictions could be a miscarriage of justice.
She's been assaulted with a weapon, and there's been more than one blow.
In this series, a living relative will attempt to clear their family name.
It appears to me that there's a lot of doubt.
Searching for new evidence.
The rather cliched motives in any killing of a spouse are money and love.
With help from two of the UK's leading barristers, one for the defence.
There is a world of difference between an unpleasant journey and murder.
And one for the prosecution.
He cut off her head, dismembered her, and buried her in a place where he hoped she would never be found.
They're on a mission to solve a mystery, submitting their findings to a Crown Court judge.
Your Honour ought to declare the conviction for murder to be unsafe.
Thank you both for your submissions. I shall consider these matters for myself.
Can this modern investigation rewrite history? In Hay-on-Wye in 1921, a poisoning occurred that swiftly became a national scandal. Lawyer and recent widower Herbert Armstrong was arrested for the attempted murder of business rival Oswald Martin by allegedly poisoning him with an arsenic-laden scone. Within 2 days of his arrest, a frenzy of suspicion raised doubt over how Mr. Armstrong's late wife had died less than a year before. 48-year-old Kitty Armstrong, also known as Kate, was exhumed and her body found to contain fatal levels of arsenic. Despite professing his innocence, 53-year-old Herbert Armstrong was found guilty of killing his wife by a jury in only 3 minutes. He was sentenced to death, and on the 31st of May 1922 at Gloucester Prison, he was hanged. It's believed he was the only British lawyer to have ever gone to the gallows. Now almost a century on, Kitty and Herbert's granddaughter Debbie is determined to uncover the truth.
This looks like a picture of my mum and my Uncle Reg and my Aunt Eleanor. Very formal picture of children.
Debbie's mother, Margaret, and her siblings were young children left orphaned by the untimely death of their parents.
My grandfather, Herbert Rowse Armstrong, and his wife, my grandmother, there they are, Grandma and Granddad, before it all kicked off. My mother became increasingly convinced towards the end of her life that the conviction was unsafe. If it was deemed unsafe now, it would leave me with a little bit of peace. I think it would be a pity that my mother never came to peace with it, but I think it would be good to know for her, because I think she came to believe at the end of her life that it was probably unsafe. So it would be nice to think that she was correct if it was unsafe. If it wasn't unsafe, I think she would have lived with it as well, but I think she would have liked a nice, balanced look at it. Yeah.
The formal charges for the murder of Kitty Armstrong triggered the abandonment of any charges for the attempted murder of Oswald Martin. But the spectre of these allegations overshadowed Armstrong's trial for the murder of his wife. But was it a miscarriage of justice? And can a modern-day legal team reach a different conclusion? Jeremy Dean QC has 30 years' experience as a prolific defence barrister. Sasha Was QC has both defended and prosecuted some of the country's highest-profile defendants. Debbie has come to London to meet Sasha and Jeremy, who will be re-examining the case.
Hello. Sasha, nice to meet you. This is Jeremy.
Hi, Jeremy. Nice to meet you.
Well, thank you very much for coming.
So, Debbie, how long have you known about the story of your grandmother and grandfather?
Well, when I was young, when I was a child, my mother always used, she was very truthful, my mother, and she used to tell me that my grandfather had died from a broken neck and that my grandmother had died from a stomach complaint.
Right.
Technically true.
How old was your mother when Kitty died and then Herbert was hanged soon after?
So I think she was about 5 years old when Herbert was hanged. Her only memory really was that, you know, she just wished she could do something so that Daddy could come home. You know, maybe if she behaved better or did something better.
What is it that makes you feel so strongly about getting to the bottom of what happened?
It impacted my mother's life a lot, and she came to believe quite strongly that it was an unsafe conviction.
Why do you think that Herbert's case was such a big deal?
I'm not sure, but I can only imagine it's because of his position in society there. Small towns love gossip.
Well, Jeremy and I will go away and we will do our work. We will try to look at this case from every single angle. And hopefully we'll have some news for you when we next meet.
OK, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Very nice to meet you.
Thank you very
Yes,
much.
you
It's been
too.
an excellent meeting you.
Yeah, thanks.
Herbert went to serve in the First World War, leaving behind his wife Kitty and their 3 children, including Debbie's mother, Margaret. In a distinguished military career, Herbert rose to the rank of Major. But on his return to Hay-on-Wye, Mr. Armstrong's relationship with Kitty deteriorated. She suffered from delusions and in 1921 was committed to an asylum. Within a month of her return to the family home, Kitty died in what was initially recorded by the family physician, Dr. Hinks, as heart disease. This was later changed to arsenic poisoning. But was Herbert Armstrong capable of murdering Kitty? Sasha and Jeremy need to start their investigation by examining the key facts of the case.
This is a case of arsenic poisoning from the early 1920s. Kitty fell ill with a variety of rheumatic and psychological conditions. Family doctor, Dr. Hinks, committed her to Barnwood Private Asylum. She was discharged in January 1921, but within a month she had deteriorated and died. Police began inquiries when a rival solicitor, Oswald Martin, claimed to have been poisoned by Armstrong with an arsenic-laden scone. The police arrested Herbert Armstrong on suspicion of the attempted murder of Oswald Martin, his business rival. Days after Herbert Armstrong's arrest, Kitty Armstrong's body was exhumed and, according to the prosecution pathologist, found to contain a large and lethal dose of arsenic. And after a 10-day trial, Armstrong was found guilty of poisoning his wife. Then, on the 31st of May, 1922, he was hanged.
Well, Jeremy, given what you've just said about Kitty and her physical and more particularly her mental health, I think we really want to consider what her state of mind was.
Yes, I agree.
We simply don't know whether she was depressed. She was only released from hospital a month before her death. We simply don't know what was going through her mind, whether she was in pain, whether she was distressed, and that may well be an important matter that wasn't fully explored at the original trial.
Herbert Armstrong always maintained he purchased arsenic only to treat dandelions in his garden. Whatever the reason, what is not disputed is that he purchased the arsenic from this very chemist in Hay-on-Wye almost a century ago. Debbie is meeting true crime author Diane Janes to understand more about the case.
Now, this shop belonged to Mr. Davis, and over the counter at shops chemists in those days, you could buy arsenic. All you had to do was walk in and sign the poisons register, and people used arsenic for lots and lots of different things then. People also used it for weed killer. Most patent weed killers in the 20s and 30s contained arsenic, and lots of people mixed up their own, as did your grandfather,
right.
Herbert.
OK.
He made his own arsenic weed killer, which was not, it sounds eccentric now, completely normal then.
In October 1921, Herbert Armstrong got embroiled in a financial dispute with Oswald Martin. In a bid to clear the air, Armstrong invited the rival lawyer to his house for afternoon tea.
During the course of this tea party, the food was bread and butter, buttered scones and some buttered currant bread. Oswald says that he distinctly remembers that Herbert picks a scone off the plate and hands it to him. And he says, "Excuse fingers."
Later that night, Oswald Martin fell violently ill. But it was not until Oswald Martin's father-in-law grew suspicious that a police investigation was triggered. That father-in-law was chemist Mr. Davis, the very man who sold arsenic to Herbert Armstrong in the first place.
Mr. Davis suggests that he take a sample of Oswald's urine, and he makes a huge song and dance about parcelling it up and putting the cork in front of witnesses.
Martin's urine sample was dispatched to a laboratory in London and tested positive for arsenic. At that point, the chemist Mr. Davis notified the Armstrongs' physician, Dr. Hinks.
Dr. Hinks now does this very interesting about-face and suddenly decides that perhaps Martin has been poisoned after all.
Armstrong was arrested on New Year's Eve 1921 under suspicion of Oswald Martin's attempted murder. But it was not only the scones that were believed to conceal fatal ingredients.
John Davis told the Martin family to be very careful about accepting food from an unknown source. And at that stage, Oswald Martin's sister-in-law contributed some interesting information. A week or so before the warning from John Davis about accepting gifts, a box of chocolates had indeed been sent to the house anonymously, and she, the sister-in-law, had eaten the chocolates. So she ate one or two of the chocolates. Thereafter, she fell ill with a bilious attack, but fortunately recovered. On the 30th of October, Oswald Martin provided a urine sample to the doctor. The scones were eaten on the 26th of October, so 4 days later, the urine sample is provided. The urine contained 1/3 of a grain of arsenic. But what happened next was that on the 31st of December, Inspector Cratchit becomes involved and takes a statement from Herbert Armstrong, and when he arrests him, in his pocket, in Herbert Armstrong's pocket, is found what the officer describes as a fatal dose of arsenic.
Sasha, I think what we need to be careful about here is the risk of collusion between Martin on the one hand, his father-in-law Davis, Hinks. Each and all of them had some motive for disliking, possibly even wanting to falsely implicate Herbert Armstrong.
There are a lot of aspects of this case which trouble me. We're talking about a small community of people where one of the main prosecution witnesses was a business rival of Herbert Armstrong. One of the other main prosecution witnesses was his father-in-law, the rival's father-in-law. So we've got an environment where there's a lot of room for malice and gossip and unreliable spite.
With Armstrong in custody, the investigation gathered pace. Driven by the suspicion of both Mr. Davis, the pharmacist, and the Armstrongs' family GP, Dr. Hinks, the focus quickly shifted to Kitty. Did she really die of natural causes? Diane Janes has brought Debbie to a local cemetery in Hay-on-Wye. This is where, on the 2nd of January 1923, after having been buried for 11 months, Debbie's grandmother Kate was exhumed.
This is a picture which was taken the next day.
Gosh.
So
Well, let's have a look in there.
Yeah, this is
Open to
obviously where,
everyone.
where they've dug the hole.
There's no screening or anything.
Nothing at all, no.
Gosh, you can only imagine how many people must have been lining up to look in that hole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
national press and lots of
Yeah.
local people have come
Yeah.
to have a goz as well and see
Yeah.
what's going on.
Yeah.
Although in theory exhumations were supposed to be done secretly under the cover of darkness, in fact the churchyard was absolutely surrounded by pressed men. And the body was actually taken across the road. There's some little cottages down there.
So not to a mortuary? Or
No, the
Gosh.
post-mortem was actually conducted in the church cottage across the road.
Cool.
So a very primitive
Yeah.
situation, really.
The story of the hay arsenic poisoning gained traction quickly right across the country. Two of the UK's most celebrated pathologists, Sir Bernard Spilsbury and Sir William Wilcox, came to perform the autopsy on Kitty. They concluded that fatal levels of arsenic were present, and Herbert Armstrong was formally charged with his wife's murder. But how accurate were these findings? Sasha and Jeremy are meeting toxicologist Professor Athol Johnston, who has studied the post-mortem report.
The presence of arsenic in the liver, does that lead you to the opinion that she had ingested arsenic within 24 hours of death?
Well, certainly 24 hours or 48 hours of death, yes.
48 hours.
In relation to the finding of the arsenic in Mrs. Armstrong's liver, obviously we can't say how it got there, whether it was deliberate or accidental, or indeed how much of it she had ingested. Is that right?
That's correct.
And do those points surface at Herbert Armstrong's trial?
I don't think so. I don't think it's the way it's been described by Wilcox or by Spilsbury. That they've made those points. Spilsbury and Wilcox gave a double act between them. I know people don't seem to think that that's what expert witnesses do, but it is obviously it's important as to how you present the evidence. And Spilsbury had taken a view that this woman had been poisoned, as I understood it, and presented the evidence in that way.
But would you challenge that? Are you saying she wasn't poisoned?
I'm reasonably certain that she'd taken arsenic. Whether she was poisoned or whether she administered herself or ingested the arsenic accidentally is not possible to say.
But just to be clear on this, that you appear to be concerned at the way the evidence of Wilcox and Spilsbury was presented, and you referred to them as a double act. Are you saying that they presented the scenario as if Mrs. Armstrong had been deliberately poisoned?
I'm not sure whether they would have seen it that way, but they certainly presented it as Mrs. Armstrong being poisoned. And by the very fact you say that, it suggests it's a deliberate act. You've no idea where the arsenic came from, and that's the issue. It's not that I don't believe for 1 minute they were wrong in the fact that she was poisoned with arsenic, but where did the arsenic come from? And that's not their job. That's the job of the rest of the evidence in the court.
But what you, as an expert, can't say, and what the experts at the trial should not have said, was this was deliberate poisoning or accidental poisoning or suicide, because those are all opinions.
If I had got this evidence, I would have reported it in a more neutral fashion.
All right, but that is a matter for a jury to assess themselves,
Yes,
not a matter for expert evidence.
No, it's for the jury to look at the facts and draw their own conclusions from that.
Thank you.
Regardless of whether the pathologist's methods were appropriate or not, what is undeniable is that Kitty did die as a result of arsenic poisoning. But what role, if any, did Herbert Armstrong play in this?
The prosecution at trial raised two possible motives for the consideration of the jury. The first was a desire to obtain benefit to be derived under a new will made by Kitty Armstrong in July 1920. However, there was no evidence that Herbert Armstrong ever sought to draw from that will, even after her death. The other was the suggestion that he wanted to marry someone who was labelled during the trial Miss X, and that motive doesn't seem to have been run with any great enthusiasm. It wasn't mentioned in the judge's summing up.
The rather cliched motives in any killing of a spouse are money and love, and they tried to explore those two here, and I entirely agree with you. They got nowhere, but it isn't the real motive if there was an unlawful killing in this case, much simpler than that, that Mr. Armstrong was a fit, healthy man in an esteemed profession who was saddled with a woman with physical and mental disabilities who had become, in effect, a liability to him. That would be the motive that might exist if this is indeed an unlawful killing.
Although I fully understand why you raise that suggestion, it wasn't raised at the trial,
No.
wasn't mentioned by the trial judge in summing up, and it may be that no one has ever introduced the spectre of that motive before. I think we need to leave this on the basis, really, that in considering the safety of Herbert Armstrong's conviction, we can't really take account of motive in the circumstances of this case.
With Armstrong awaiting trial for Kitty's murder, the town of Hay-on-Wye became spellbound by this high-profile poisoning. Even though charges against Armstrong for the attempted murder of his business rival Oswald Martin were never pursued, they dominated the debate. Debbie's come to her local library to examine whether this discourse could have sown the seeds for an unfair trial.
It's interesting, isn't it, that at the beginning of this it talks about sensational evidence and the mystery box of poisoned chocolates and the buttered scone and the hay drama. It's been like a game of chess played with a master hand with dramatic flourishes that has staggered the onlooker and worked up to today's supreme climax. Dearie me, it's so sensational, the reporting. Yet when he stepped into court, there was only a touch of tiredness superimposed on the placid exterior that has been one of the marvels of this marvellous trial. I love the way they describe it as a marvellous trial, as if it's a delicious thing to be savoured over. All the coverage is about what happened in the courthouse and nothing to do with the evidence or the story. Hard to see how you could recruit an unbiased jury. So you would think, yes. I mean, if this has been reported and everybody's talking about it in the way that people are talking about it, and he's going to be tried locally, it's hard to see how you could ever get a jury who are going to sit and not have preconceived ideas of what's happened. Gossip, really, isn't it? But there's no gossip on his side. So he might have felt quite alone, yeah.
Herbert Armstrong's trial for the murder of his wife began at Herefordshire Hall on the 3rd of April 1922. His sole defence was that Kitty had committed suicide. Only a month before her death, she had been discharged from Barnwood Asylum. Sasha and Jeremy want to understand her state of mind during this period, so they're meeting nursing historian Dr. Sarah Cheney.
Hello, how do you do, Jeremy? Nice to meet you. Have you seen evidence that Kitty Armstrong was suicidal?
There doesn't appear to be any evidence of that in the notes from the institution, which is actually quite surprising because that was one of the things they were particularly concerned about.
While someone like Kitty Armstrong was in a place like Barnwood, how would the risk of suicide be controlled?
Anyone thought to be a risk would have it flagged on their record to make sure that staff are watching them and keeping them away from anything that might be dangerous. So it would be flagged throughout her record as well. And on her discharge.
So can I just pick up what Jeremy said? There's nothing you've seen on the notes suggesting that whatever her psychiatric diagnosis, there is nothing to suggest she had suicidal tendencies. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
Kitty Armstrong was discharged in January 1921. According to what you've read, what was her condition?
So she's not regarded as being recovered, so presumably is still to an extent depressed and perhaps voicing some of these delusions. But the doctor's not very specific on that point.
The fact that someone doesn't have a history of it doesn't mean when they're suffering from a condition like Kitty Armstrong's that they wouldn't act in a suicidal fashion. Do you agree?
Yes, of course.
And we know that Herbert Armstrong's defence was that his wife must have committed suicide. But in fact, there is no contemporaneous evidence from anybody who treated Mrs. Armstrong that she was indeed suicidal.
Yes, that's true.
Despite there being serious doubt over whether Kitty was suicidal, it formed the bedrock of Herbert Armstrong's defence at his 10-day trial. Debbie has come to the very courthouse in Hereford and has tracked down an account of one of the jurors from her grandfather's trial.
As a witness, Armstrong created a good impression up to a certain point, but he had such pat answers for everything that it was impossible to believe he was an innocent man, and he came out badly out of the judge's questioning. It's striking that the jury feel that because my grandfather had a rational, decent explanation for what had happened, in their mind, that made him more likely to be guilty, not less likely to be guilty. You've got to feel sympathy for the fact that he maintained his calm the whole way through and that people misinterpreted that as a telegraph of guilt. What people took from it was that, you know, there's got to be something wrong with this guy. He's not reacting emotionally, he's just calm. He's got to be a calm killer.
The jury retired to consider everything they had heard over the last fortnight. But astonishingly, it only took them 3 minutes to find Herbert Armstrong guilty of murdering his wife.
And then Mr. Justice Darling addresses my granddad, saying, "It's now my duty to merely pronounce the sentence of the court. It is that you'd be taken hence to a place from which you came, that you be taken thence to a place of lawful execution, and that you be there hanged by the neck until you be dead." He'd made up his mind, Justice Darling, that the suicide theory didn't wash, and he was going to force that one home as hard as he could, I think. He was going to impress on the jury that that's what he believed, and that they should believe what he believed, that Armstrong was guilty and that the suicide theory was impossible.
Herbert Armstrong lodged an appeal for clemency, but it was unanimously rejected. He was left to count down the days to his execution at Gloucester Jail. Debbie wants an insight into her grandfather's final hours, so she's come to the prison to meet historian Patrick Lowe.
Herbert's condemned cell would have been just where this building is at one time. There would have been an extension built out, which they built in 1912, so that they could completely house the new scaffold, because older prisoners before that would have been executed in the yard in public. So this is about as private as execution ever got, really. In the reports of the condemned cell, you hear that the doors completely separated the scaffold from where he was. Right. So he would have never seen that until the last minute, but it would have been on this...
the other side of his cell all the
just literally the other side of the whole time he was there, basically. Although it's not there, you can sort of really get a sense of, and also the scale of it, really. So we get to the day of Herbert's actual execution, and he had a fairly restless night, we're told, from the hangman John Ellis's diaries. I think he was obviously troubled with thoughts at the time.
You could ever sleep tonight?
Yeah, well, Herbert's reported to have said that, really.
Yeah.
He says it's a difficult thing to sleep when you know you're going to die. By the time of about 7:45, we hear reports that there's a crowd forming outside the prison. At this time, crowds would not have been allowed in to see it, but over on the far side of the prison, at the prison gate, there's a crowd forming, and we hear that there's men, women, even children there. In his final moments, it's incredibly quick, really. John Ellis, the hangman, comes in. He pinions his arms, and then he goes through the doors, sets himself at the scaffold, and John's assistant takes Herbert through, and Herbert says goodbye to people. He's obviously befriended the staff there, and he says his goodbyes. He's put on the trapdoors, and as quickly as possible, John Ellis puts a white hood over his head, and in John's diary, the hangman actually notes that Herbert said as his final words, "I'm coming, Kate." I think It was obvious what was on his mind right in his final moments. Obviously, his final thoughts are there with Kate.
Herbert Armstrong's defence was that his wife committed suicide. But with Judgment Day imminent, Jeremy has identified a potential inconsistency in the final moments of the original trial.
When the judge discussed the case of Oswald Martin before the jury, explaining that if you come to the conclusion what he did with poison, that he was prepared not merely to use it on dandelions and things of that kind, but he was prepared to use it on a human being. So in my view, judge's directions on the evidence to do with the Oswald Martin case were bad, poor quality and wrong.
I agree that's not a sensible course. Does it render that piece of evidence so damaged that it renders the trial unfair? I'm not sure it does.
The law then was the same as it is today. Prosecution have the burden of proving the defendant's guilt. The prosecution must prove it so that the jury are sure of guilt. Nothing less will do. His direction was unclear. Then the judge said this: a verdict of not guilty consequently does not mean that he has proved himself to be innocent. Nothing of the kind. It means that the Crown have not proved him to be guilty. That is all. If you have a reasonable doubt as to whether he's proved guilty or not, you must say not guilty. That is a truly confusing direction.
Of course, he uses the phrases that the prosecution have to prove it. He uses the phrases reasonable doubt. But it's a very easy direction to give to a jury. You say the burden of proof is on the prosecution. The prosecution have to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt or so that you're sure. He never put it in that simple way.
It may not be surprising that the jury found Herbert Armstrong guilty in 3 minutes if they either thought that the defence had the burden of proof or they were confused. The most troubling aspect of the judge's summing up, he gave the impression that it was for the defence to prove innocence, failed to direct the jury that it was for the prosecution to prove so that the jury was sure that the defendant is guilty. If the jury didn't know what the burden and standard of proof were or might not have done, then this conviction of Herbert Armstrong's is unsafe. There's no argument about it.
Executed prisoners were laid to rest in unconsecrated ground within the prison walls. Debbie wants to pay her respects to her grandfather. It's believed that he was buried on this spot in Gloucester Prison.
Unmarked, unacknowledged, and if my grandfather had murdered my grandmother, then maybe that's a good thing. But if not, maybe it's a little bit sad that there's no way of knowing where his final resting place is. Whether or not he was guilty, it's hard to see that that was properly proven, that he was guilty beyond all reasonable doubt, because it appears to me that there's a lot of doubt, and especially in his final words, "I'm coming to you, Kate." That doesn't sound to me like the words of a man who murdered his wife. Especially because I can see now the effect it had more on my mother's life, which explains some of her character to me, and really understanding what her upbringing was in the context of what had been alleged against him and how she'd grown up in the shadow of all of that. So it's been really valuable to make that connection again.
Sasha and Jeremy have completed their investigation and must now put their submissions to Judge David Radford. Jeremy needs to convince the judge of something new.
I'm very much of the view that the arguments I have available to me will result in Herbert Armstrong's conviction being declared unsafe by Judge Radford.
Debbie is hoping today her belief that her grandfather could be innocent will be vindicated.
What I'm hoping for today is to get some sort of definitive answer. Having had it looked at dispassionately by barristers and decided on by a judge, it would be good to know.
Debbie, hello.
Hello.
Nice to see you again.
Hi, Debbie.
Hello.
How are you feeling about today?
I think I would hope that that it would result in the conviction not being safe.
All right, well, I believe that the judge is more or less ready to see us.
OK.
Sasha and Jeremy must now present their arguments to Judge David Radford. With over 14 years as the senior judge to the largest Crown Court in England and Wales, he's tried some of the country's highest profile murder cases.
We are here today for me to consider the safety of the conviction of murder of Herbert Rowse Armstrong on the 13th of April 1922. Mr. Dean, what would you like to add?
This case involves Herbert Armstrong having been convicted of the murder of his wife, Kitty Armstrong. She was initially thought to have died from natural causes and buried without suspicion. 8 months later, a police investigation began when Oswald Martin, a rival solicitor, claimed to have been poisoned at the hands of Herbert Armstrong. And further suspicion was generated when it was suggested that Mr. Armstrong had poisoned Oswald Martin's sister-in-law through having sent a box of chocolates, which she ate, and it was said that she too suffered arsenic poisoning. Clinical examination determined that Oswald Martin had arsenic in his urine. Kitty Armstrong's body was then exhumed. He was tried for the murder of Mrs. Armstrong because it was said that her body was found to contain a fatal dose of arsenic. And as Your Honour has said, he was convicted and hanged on the 31st of May, 1922. It is believed is the only UK lawyer to have faced the gallows. As Your Honour knows, Mr. Armstrong's defence was one of suicide. However, in the course of this inquiry, we have received a great deal of assistance from Dr. Sarah Cheney, confirming that Mrs. Armstrong had a very checkered and volatile psychological background. So that background has been of great assistance, and in our submission, coming now, as I do, to the point of law that's been identified, that material has emerged to support the contention that Mr. Armstrong's conviction is to be regarded as unsafe. It's my submission that the judge made a fatal error in a manner which I submit was reversing the burden of proof. It's my submission that the judge clearly and wrongly directed the jury that for Mr. Armstrong to succeed on the defence of suicide, he had the burden of proving suicide. That was wrong in law. Burden of proof was reversed. In my submission, that was a fatal error by the learned judge. I therefore submit that Your Honour ought to regard Mr. Armstrong's conviction as unsafe.
Thank you, Mr. Dean. Ms. Wass, what is your response?
Firstly, Dr. Sarah Cheney, who was the nursing historian, confirmed that there was nothing in Kitty Armstrong's medical records that suggested that she was suicidal. She had a volatile personality and clearly had some mental health issues, which was why she was committed to an asylum, but there was no history of depression. So that part of the prosecution case was supported by the modern-day expert. The other aspect that we made inquiries about was the toxicology, and we had the advantage of speaking to a modern-day expert, Professor Athol Johnson. And Professor Johnson confirmed the presence of a significant dose of arsenic in Kitty Armstrong's liver at the time of the autopsy. And there was, in effect, no legitimate reason for her having any arsenic in her system at the time of her death on the 22nd of February. So that part of the prosecution case has also been validated by the modern-day inquiry. Having said all of that, I have grave concerns about the judge's remarks which were read to Your Honour by Mr. Dean a moment ago. Those remarks were made within seconds of the jury's retirement. So they would have been the words ringing in the jury's ears as they went out to consider their verdict. And I cannot contradict the submissions that Mr. Dean has made on this point.
Well, yes, thank you, indeed, Miss Wass. In due course, I shall let you know when I'm ready to express my view on the matter.
Thank you.
The legal arguments have now been presented to the judge. But have both barristers done enough to question the original conviction?
What are your thoughts?
I think it's reassuring that you've both taken a look at the evidence and you've both come to the same conclusion about the flaws in the judge's summing up. And hopefully the judge will take the same view.
Yeah, we'll find out soon enough.
Yes.
But
Okay.
just need to be patient, and the judge will call us back in as soon as he's ready.
OK, well, thank you both for your...
It's an absolute pleasure.
Investigations, yeah.
Did Herbert Armstrong poison a business rival with an arsenic-laden scone, kick-starting a cascade of suspicion, leading directly to his wife Kitty's murder? Or was he simply a victim of an unfair trial? The judge is now ready to deliver his verdict.
The case for the prosecution was formidable evidence to infer that the defendant was the person who had poisoned his wife. The focus by both counsel before me as to the safety now of the conviction rests essentially entirely on the latter part of the summing up. This was, I agree with learned counsel, a very serious misdirection of law, and it came at a most sensitive time in the judge's summing up when he was crystallising the issue in relation to his legal directions for the jury. May be, indeed, that had they been properly directed, it is very likely, indeed, the same verdict would have been returned by them. But the defendant was entitled to have the law properly set out, and for the defence he had relied on to be considered in accordance with the law correctly put forward. That not having been done, I judge that the conviction for that reason only would be regarded as unsafe. I shall rise.
Hopefully you found this trip that you've been on worthwhile from every possible perspective.
Very definitely. And thank you both for your efforts.
All right, well, it's been fantastic meeting you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, Debbie.
Yeah. Ultimately, I think the compelling thing that's come out of this whole journey is that the conviction was unsafe. Slight sting in the tail that there is still, he felt that there was compelling evidence against my grandfather. But at the end of the day, I think you have to rely on the rule of law and the rule of law being applied correctly. And I think that would have given my mother some comfort.